Welcome to CEVAW Conversations, a podcast by the ARC Centre of Excellence for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. I'm your host, Sian Human, and today we're exploring an alarming global issue that deeply concerns us as violence prevention researchers, the link between climate change and gender-based violence. Climate change is causing rising temperatures that are wreaking havoc on our environments, from rising sea levels displacing communities to prolonged droughts straining resources. The impacts of climate change reverberate through societies in complex ways, and one of the ripple effects is an increase in violence against women, girls, and other vulnerable groups. But how exactly does environmental upheaval fuel this abuse? We have a powerful lineup of experts working in disaster research, international development, and gendered violence to explore this intersection in depth. They'll share eye-opening research, compelling stories from the front lines, and successful community-led solutions being implemented around the world. By the end of this episode, you'll have a deeper understanding of how the changing climate can enable violence in our homes, communities, and beyond. We're going to examine the impact of this global crisis and the bold steps needed to create a safe future for all of us. Our first guest is Celeste Harris, a CEVAW researcher working at the intersection of gender-based violence and climate-induced disasters. Celeste, thanks for joining us. Could you tell us a bit about yourself and how you ended up working in this area?
Hi, Sian. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me today. It's a privilege to be able to speak about this work and the research that I've been involved in. And I'm joining you today from unceded Bundjalung country up in northern New South Wales. I'm currently a researcher working particularly in the intersection of gender-based violence and climate-induced disasters. And I'm currently undertaking a PhD with CEVAW, the Centre of Excellence for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. And I also do research with the Disrupting Violence Beacon up at Griffith University. I began in the area of environmental science and particularly focusing on floodplain and natural hazard management. And then later I transitioned into social work. And obviously this area, it's a highly disaster-prone area of Australia. So recently we lived through the major 2022 floods and multiple other flood events surrounding that one. We had unprecedented bushfires occurring in our rainforests up here prior to those floods. And more recently, we had Cyclone Alfred impacting our communities. So personally, I've been on the ground during and between these events, both as a community member, but also through my work that I was doing. And it means that I've been able to witness firsthand the absolute devastation of these events, as well as the inadequacy of our preparation and responses on the ground. And then connected to all of that, I've been able to really see the gendered dynamics of the disaster responses and hear about the violence that women and other diverse groups are experiencing in these contexts and some of the high risk scenarios that continue to exist related to disasters up here.
Having lived through those devastating events yourself while also working in this space must give you such a unique perspective on what's actually happening on the ground. When you decided to research this formally, how did you go about studying something that you were seeing firsthand? What were you looking for and what did you discover?
So prior to beginning my PhD, last year we had a publication come out on a project that I was working with Professor Jenny Bodie and a team at Griffith University. And the catalyst for that project is that we were noticing after the bushfires in 2019 and 2020, people were talking about this link, primarily around domestic violence increasing related to these disaster events. And we were hearing this on the ground and we were also noticing this in the media. And so we wanted to really take a good look at what is the evidence telling us in terms of this association and how is it being measured. We know that hearing the stories and experiences of those living these experiences is absolutely vital, but we also wanted to understand from a research perspective what was some of the quantitative data telling us to support what we were hearing. So we did a systematic review, which essentially means going out and looking at all the studies that were measuring intimate partner violence specifically and disasters, natural disasters across the globe. Overall, what we found is really strong evidence coming out from those studies that measured this association that showed that exposure to these disaster events exacerbates intimate partner violence. So we ended up with 27 articles that measured this association, and almost 90% of those were measuring an increase in this violence during or following the disaster. And this was across physical, psychological, and sexual forms of intimate partner violence. What we were seeing as well in these studies was that it was occurring in the response period, so immediately during and following the disaster, but also in some communities, these increases in intimate partner violence that were being measured were happening years following. So, for example, following Hurricane Katrina, it was measured that intimate partner violence experienced by women in their temporary accommodation displacement camps was measured up to 2 years after the original event. The other pattern that we noticed from these studies was that this relationship between disasters and increased intimate partner violence was happening across different disaster types. It was happening across different countries and in different cultural settings. And what that really highlighted for us was the absolute scale of this issue. This is not something that's necessarily just happening in a specific community, a specific pocket. This is a global issue that's a risk for women across the globe in different low, middle income, high income countries. We saw studies from earthquakes in Japan, tsunamis and cyclones in India, hurricanes in the US, floods in New Zealand, in Kenya, and this pattern was emerging across these various contexts. So what that really created was some strong foundational research for us that supported what we were hearing on the ground. And I think it's pretty clear now from this research, but also a number of other studies that have been coming out recently as well, there is more than enough evidence to support that there is an association between increased violence against women and these increasing disasters that we're now experiencing across the globe. And so now, from this original research, I'm interested in starting to shift the focus from as many people looking at what the risks are in this scenario towards what it is that also helps prevent and protect women in the context of these, what we know are going to be increasing disaster events across the world.
Are there any particular factors that contribute to this increased risk in the context of climate-induced disasters?
I'd love to give you a really simple answer, but it's obviously a more complex picture than it can appear. And what our research suggested was that these disaster contexts, what they tend to do from the studies we looked at is exacerbate pre-existing risks and vulnerabilities that exist in communities, but they also can create new forms of risk and vulnerability for women and other diverse groups. And I think there's some similar research that recently got undertaken by Alyssa Thurston and her team in London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And they talked about these 3 pathways that they theorised based on the literature. And the pathways are that being exposed to a disaster can increase stresses that then trigger violence against women. So if you think about poor mental health that's linked to disasters, loss of housing and livelihoods, these stresses have been known to be able to increase the risk of violence. The second pathway is thinking about disaster exposure increasing the enabling environments for violence. So what that means is that the environments around women can become riskier. So there might be, for example, poor law enforcement or poor housing environments or evacuation centres where you're exposed to perpetrators or people that use violence. So that means that these enabling environments create risk for violence against women. And then the third pathway was around exacerbating those underlying drivers of violence against women. So there's some research that looks at, for example, how social norms and gender inequalities are further divided during these events, and that gender norms can become much more rigid when we go through a disaster, and then that can also increase risk of violence to women. So when we looked at the research that measured associations between these events, the most prevalent risk factors that emerged really highlighted the vulnerability of the women that are most at risk in these situations, because it was primarily those in those precarious housing situations, so such as being in a displacement camp. So being in one of these camps in this temporary housing was found to significantly increase intimate partner violence, as I said, both during and then in the years following the event. Mental ill health was also found to be one of the most prevalent risk factors for women experiencing violence in the post-disaster time. So, for example, women with depression, suffering from PTSD, and those stresses associated with living through a disaster, having those co-occurring mental ill health conditions also led to an increased risk of intimate partner violence. Another factor that emerged from the studies was partner alcohol consumption. So there were a number of studies that looked at whether there was a relationship and found that those women that had partners that were consuming alcohol following the disasters had a higher risk of experiencing violence in their partnership compared to those who had husbands that didn't consume alcohol. And then another one that emerged, which is obviously very important, was around not having those community resources and social supports. So women that weren't able to access support networks or services being disrupted during and following disasters were at higher risk of experiencing intimate partner violence. There's not a simple solution to this, but there's also a lot of knowledge and research that's now emerging to help us understand these various factors and where we can start to intervene. So being able to understand the complexities doesn't mean that it's too hard for us to address. It just means that we have a better picture now of where and when we need to be intervening to be able to support women during these events.
So you've spoken a bit about risks and protective factors. What are some areas we need to explore further, and what sort of solutions are already emerging?
Risk has been a primary focus of much of the research coming out of this area and this space, and that's absolutely where the focus has needed to be. It's very important to understand the risks that increase the likelihood of violence. But what I would also argue is that it's as important to also start to shift towards equally understanding what prevents and protects women in these circumstances. In terms of the research that we will be looking at moving forward, and I know at CEVAW we're going to be trying to understand the impacts of these shocks on gender-based violence more broadly in the Indo-Pacific region. And the piece of work that I'll be focusing on is trying to identify what is it that protects women in these circumstances, being able to then identify some of the strengths and community strengths and the resiliences and protections that exist in community, and helping us to build an understanding of that so that we can inform advocacy, policy and practice in this space. And just linking to that, thinking back to the context of the Northern Rivers, and there's some research that Newcastle Uni did in the Lismore context that really has highlighted that we talk a lot about the vulnerabilities of women and other groups in these disasters, but women and other groups also take on absolute empowering roles during disasters. So we saw that with our First Nations women and communities. We saw that with our women as leaders and responders during disasters, preparing for disasters and between disaster events in this part of the world. And we see that in other locations too. And these roles are sometimes overlooked. There's also such extensive knowledge and expertise and strengths that exist in these groups and communities that we as researchers can help elevate in our roles moving forward. And I think that's going to be really important as we work alongside communities to try and help push this issue to create broader policy and practice change so that it's something that's being recognised as the world experiences more and more disasters.
And that lived experience expertise just brings such rich insight into these scenarios and really helps to clarify whether the proposed solutions will actually be effective.
Absolutely, Sian, you're spot on. And the thing is we can't necessarily go with a cookie cutter approach in these contexts. I think there's a need to have understandings at multiple scales. Communities are already doing incredible work. Those survivors, those First Nations communities hold so much knowledge and experience that can only add immense value to the research that we're doing to be able to then inform what's going to work in a particular setting, in a particular disaster. That's the other side of things. Different disasters are going to be impacting in different locations. Multiple disasters now. We're going to see more compounding disasters, such as I described, with bushfires, and we've got floods, and we've got a cyclone. Much of the research in Australia, and there has been some really important foundational research that's taken place, particularly in Victoria. I'll just mention Deborah Parkinson and Claire Zara did a study in 2013 on bushfires that really brought attention to this issue. And that's really helped influence some of the advocacy and policy that's been happening in Australia, especially in Victoria, and the work of the Gender and Disaster Australia initiative. But it's a starting point, and I think we need more elevation of those voices, those experiences on the ground, as well as understanding across a variety of disasters, a variety of contexts, those diverse groups and experiences, and then those different scales. We cannot avoid that this is the future. And it's happening now in our regional and remote areas, and it's going to be impacting more and more and more. And if we don't start addressing this and coming together and shining a light on this issue as researchers, as communities, as practitioners, as policymakers, it's not going away. And the time is now.
While Celeste's work is focused on the Australian context, these insights are broadly applicable. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Betty Barkha, whose work explores the gendered impacts of climate change in the Pacific region.
Hello, my name is Betty Barkha, and I'm currently the Gender Equality, Disability and Social Inclusion Technical Advisor with Save the Children in the Pacific. I completed my PhD at Monash University, which was focused on the gendered impacts of climate change-induced mobility in the Pacific, with a specific focus on Fiji, and have had a decade of experience working in international development across the globe, most commonly focused on Asia and the Pacific.
Thanks for speaking with me, Betty. What initially drew you to this area of work?
While I was starting off as a young graduate working in the space of international development, I was based out of Thailand with an organization called the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development. And through that organization, I did a lot of work with the UN systems and mechanisms and all of the complexities of dealing with intergovernmental negotiations, which is where government leaders come and negotiate on a particular piece of document. While across a few of those, I realized that there was always this mention of lack of evidence around climate change and the gendered impacts of climate change. And I realized that was what I wanted to do my research on, ensuring its linkages to what it means in the broader geopolitical side of things. And so it was a pretty easy decision on why I wanted to do it. But I also wanted to be one of the voices that reinforce specific feminist voices in academia. And so that was one of the reasons. So I wanted to be able to draft the evidence, develop the evidence myself, and use my own voice to do it, but also make sure that it was robust and aligned with sort of global conversations on that theme.
I love that you saw this gap and thought, I'm going to do something about that. If only everybody had such drive. Now, could you help us understand how climate change is a gendered issue? Doesn't it just apply to everybody?
It absolutely does apply to everybody, but not everybody experiences it the same way. And that is why it is a gendered issue. What it in simple terms means is that everybody experiences impacts of climate change differently, which really is a person living in urban Sydney will experience it very differently to a person living in rural Solomon Islands or a person living in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. And what that means also is that women, men, boys, and girls will also experience very different aspects of climate change and natural disasters and what that looks like. So their experiences are very different based on where it comes from. So yes, of course, everybody is impacted by climate change, but individual experiences differ because we're not homogeneous groups.
Yeah, that's such an important distinction. Everyone's affected, but the experiences are so different depending on who you are and where you live. Now, you've done extensive research specifically looking at these gendered impacts. What were some of the findings from your work on planned climate relocation?
My PhD had a huge focus on the Pacific, but specifically looked at Fiji as a case study. And one of the key findings was, unsurprisingly, that there were gendered gaps in climate governance. And what that meant was from the community level to provincial or national levels, and then even at regional and global levels, there was just a disparity in women across their diversity being represented or leading the work in the manner that they wanted to. There were very few, and I'll start from like global level. Globally, when you have conferences like Conference of Parties on Climate Change, there is some statistics around how many heads of delegations are women, how many lead negotiators are women, or gender non-binary people. There is sort of growing evidence around that. And it's not surprising to see that there is a disparity in, let alone reaching equity in that area. But at the national level, the Pacific Islands are some of the most underrepresented in terms of having women and gender diverse people in parliament. And that's grounded in sociocultural norms that reinforce that men are natural leaders, which then means that all of the policies and the language that come around climate change adaptation or mitigation efforts sort of tend to overlook what the impacts really mean for women and girls and gender diverse people. And that's sort of a national, global level picture. And I don't want to discount the shifts that have happened across the world, right? That being said, like, yes, there is a sort of gendered gap in climate governance across the world, but there have been shifts. And those shifts documented across my PhD came from the household level. And that was super reassuring for me. There were very hopeful stories when I went into communities and when I was talking to households. I was talking to moms and dads and children. I was talking to a range of actors. And one of the most obvious things were within the household, there's an obvious shift that couples where they were making collective decisions about what it meant for the household to do particular things or prepare for a particular disaster, or what it meant if they had to move in the case of a climate emergency. So household gender dynamics were shifting towards sort of more collaborative decisions. And that was assuring. But there was also this shift from fathers who were like, I would not want to do what my father did. And I want a better world for my daughter and my son. Therefore, I'm making sure that my wife is a part of these decisions, right? And so that shift within the household was very assuring in terms of sort of understanding the role families played. And this was specific to climate change. So my questions were very specific to, like, what happens when you're having to relocate, or who makes those decisions? And so that's really where I think the gist is, that there are shifts happening and they're slow and subtle, and we just need to be able to hold safe spaces for that to be reflected at a national level.
It is encouraging to hear that it's happening kind of at that micro household level, though. Could you maybe reflect a little bit on how climate relocation affects the risk of gender-based violence?
I don't want us to be thinking that there is one singular cause to it. Sexual and gender-based violence have various contributing factors to this, but climate change does exacerbate the risks of sexual and gender-based violence for historically marginalized populations. And again, I'm saying gender-based violence because I recognize that increasingly there is sort of risks to men and boys, but women and girls and gender non-binary folks remain most at risk and have had the most violence perpetrated to them. And I speak from my experience with the PhD research and the work that I do across the Pacific. So one of the things that's been very evident is every time there is a natural disaster, there is notable increase in people seeking safe homes and safe shelters. And by people, I mean women and girls largely. So there is a need for us to create child-friendly and women-friendly spaces, absolutely as a part of our humanitarian response nowadays, just in recognition and in response to that. What that also means is the unpaid care roles of women also increase. So the stress of providing for families, taking care of children, taking care of elderly, while also being displaced from the home, still predominantly lies within the hands of women and girls. And that's quite directly linked to increasing stress levels. And one of the things we are struggling with in the Pacific is capturing this evidence in that way. Capturing violence against women data, violence against children data, or gender-based violence data is very tricky in the Pacific for a range of reasons. But there are indications that post-natural disasters, for instance, there is an increase in people seeking help from crisis centers and police, and that's one way we're looking at it.
And I realised as you were talking before about how you were going into the homes to talk to people about the climate impacts, it's quite unusual in that kind of gender-based violence space to actually get information from inside the home because it's kind of considered a private sphere. So it's good that you were able to get information at that level.
Absolutely. And it's grounded. I think it's quite easy to have conversations around climate change and children and education and mobility. But as cultures would have it, people are naturally hesitant to talk about gender and power dynamics overall, let alone violence.
Are there any kind of overlooked or hidden impacts of climate change and relocation on marginalised groups?
I think so. And I think so because there is increasing evidence that says it, but also because I know that historically marginalized voices continue to be marginalized in existing structures. And despite efforts of social inclusion, trying to shift systems and structures to make sure that they are included, meaningful inclusion is still quite challenging. So, for instance, if we're talking about engaging people in the Pacific, and one piece of when I was doing my PhD, it was a very small project. It was targeted in particular areas that I only accessed because I had specific resources to do so. However, even with bigger, larger scale projects that are state led, sort of planned relocation efforts, for instance, who gets help first? Which community gets help? How is the help going to be offered? What is the nature of that help? All does get impacted by like who is connected to who, the socioeconomic standing of that particular group. So, for instance, one of the first villages in Fiji that got relocated completely as a result of impacts of climate change, in one of the elections didn't vote for the leader that actually was the one to lead the entire relocation effort, and subsidize it through the state. And it just so happened that the prime minister at that point actually, went back and said, you all are ungrateful people. How dare you not vote for me again? Because I really helped you come out of this mess. I was the one who listened to you. So the Pacific gets rather complicated that way, right?
Mm.
So even if there's these sort of sociocultural politics that you kind of play into, and I guess that was one example from Fiji, but there was an example from the Solomon Islands where sort of consultants went into a village and they were like, well, okay, the men, how about you map what the ideal village would look like? And for the women, they were like, how about you map what the ideal village would look like if we relocated it? And then they tried to sort of merge it and make it look, got them all together and said, show us your map, and we'll try to do something better. And in the process of doing something meaningful, it just so happened that they ran out of money and could not actually end up relocating the village, but had undergone, these tiresome exercises with the villagers in doing so. So there's a lot of things that are at play here, right? Like even with the most well-intended inclusion efforts, there's so much that could go wrong in trying to include voices from those who have been historically marginalized. And then even if you do get their voices, how does that get reflected? How does that get accounted for? Are there any repercussions that prevent further harm from happening? So things like that are still very tricky.
It's tricky, especially with such a diverse and disperse groups of people across all of the Pacific who are grappling with these issues together, but separately.
Absolutely.
Now, your work has informed the development of the Pacific Regional Framework on Climate Mobility. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
So in very basic ways, the Pacific Regional Framework on Climate Mobility is the second regional framework of its kind where sort of a sub-region has decided that they're going to think about climate mobility in a very systematic way. And thankfully, one of the things that has happened is that my PhD, which I was hoping was going to inform policy of some sort, and in that process, I was actually speaking to a lot of scholars. And one of the scholars remembered what my PhD was on and pulled me in when they were drafting the framework. And surprisingly so, there is language in the Pacific Regional Framework, which directly comes out of my PhD recommendations. For instance, it talks about intergenerational and intersectional inclusions to climate mobility. And of course, these are very broad terms, and they're meant to be so, and they're meant to be accompanied by detailed operating procedures, which are yet to be developed. But just the fact that language such as intersectional and intergenerational is reflected in a Pacific Islands Forum Leaders document is a huge win, and I'm still quite proud of that actually.
Yeah, that's wonderful. You should absolutely be proud of that. It must be so satisfying to see your research actually making it into policy documents like that. So, when it comes to putting these frameworks into practice, what are some of the strategies for making sure relocation and adaptation efforts are actually inclusive and gender responsive?
Much of it isn't as surprising as people expect it to be. It really is about finding legal pathways for people to feel safe and secure and move with dignity. And I want to reiterate that with my research, while I was looking at the gendered impacts of climate mobility, there were very clear narratives that people didn't want to move. So this fear of people moving and taking over particular elements of what is not theirs is not something to be feared, because people, particularly Pacific Islands people, did not want to move, but they were being forced and pushed out of their homes because their homes were no longer livable. Salt water was coming in, vegetable farming was becoming difficult, cyclones were increasing in frequency, droughts were increasing in frequency, impacting access to services such as healthcare or education. So I think in doing so, some of the recommendations and pathways that have been proposed in the regional framework are about recognizing the injustices of climate change as a whole globally, and the impacts of those on the front lines who have contributed absolutely not even it's insignificantly to what is the main cause of human impact, climate change. I think it's about recognizing the injustices, taking pathways that actually move away and talk about transformative ways and meaningful ways in providing safe homes for people to move, and to move with dignity too, right? So it's not about being thought of as charity cases or people like, we helped you and you really need to be grateful to us. It's about recognizing that nobody should have to go through this, and the capacities of Pacific Island countries are much less than those of other places in the world, and that's really where it stems from.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Listening to you now, I'm really struck by how unfair the situation is. The countries that have contributed practically nothing to climate change are the ones facing its worst impacts. And as you say, nobody actually wants to leave their home and community. They're being forced to.
But I think there is also a role that corporations have had to play in this whole process, and they're pretty much getting away with a get out of jail free card in all of this, right? So there's a lot of focus on what states can do and what international mechanisms can do, which is great because that's where the responsibility at the end of the day does lie. I think there is some research around the top 20 corporations that have contributed significantly to what we know is the reason behind climate change. So there is some stats around that. And I think, yes, governments and United Nations and development banks and all of these need to be able to hold people accountable for their actions. And that's really it, recognizing the role that corporations have played in the injustice, which is now climate injustice, and then being able to find a way to be able to find a just transition away from climate change, which is beneficial for all populations, but particularly for those who have been most marginalized, such as women and girls and gender non-binary people, right? So finding a way to hold those accountable, but making sure that the transition does not reinforce what has always been a cycle of inequality, but something that is different because we have the resources and tools to shift that.
That's such an important point about corporate accountability. They really have been getting off way too easily, haven't they? I imagine we're mainly talking about the big oil, coal, and gas companies. I'll include some of the research on specific corporations in the show notes. Before we wrap up, were there any other key points you wanted to highlight?
I would like to add some components around the loss of land in the context of climate change. So there various communities where the sense of identity and well-being is very closely related to the ecosystem, so particular plants or flora and fauna or the ocean or the land. And with rising sea levels or increasing acidity in the oceans, depletion of freshwater systems and flora and fauna, a lot of indigenous people and people who know nothing else other than to rely on the ecosystem around them, there's been impacts that are considered violence against them, right? And violence takes different forms. And in recognizing this, I think it's quite crucial for us to recognize that physical violence is one thing, emotional violence is another, but the violence that is being perpetrated through impacts of climate change in various forms has very different impacts for different people. There is a study from PNG whereby men actually have admitted that seeing their land being washed away is increasingly making them question who they are. And in essence, they have sort of become more violent. Obviously, that research is a little bit complicated, so I don't think it has been progressed further. But there are sort of elements of gender-based violence that are directly linked to people's loss of land and livelihoods. And I think we shouldn't lose touch of that as well.
Dr. Betty Barkha, thank you for raising such critical points and sharing important perspectives from the Pacific region. Our next guest is from ActionAid Australia, an organisation working to ensure corporations do take responsibility for their role in driving climate injustice, as well as supporting communities affected by climate change.
So I'm Michelle Higelin. I'm the Executive Director at ActionAid Australia. I've worked on women's rights for the last 30 years, both in Australia and internationally, including extensive work on responding to violence against women, as well as climate change over the last decade or more with ActionAid. And increasingly, we've been working on how these two things come together, and particularly some of the gendered impacts of climate change.
Thanks for speaking with us, Michelle. Could you share some examples of how you see gender-based violence and climate change intersecting?
Well, I think it's important to remember that globally, gender-based violence exists in every country in the world outside of climate-related disasters. And so what we see is really that existing violence that's there does increase in a time of crisis, particularly when, families and communities face greater insecurity and sometimes displacement, which, obviously exposes women and girls to an increased risk of violence. And so, for example, if you are displaced and you end up in a shelter, then, that poses a whole range of risks, particularly if you're detached from your family, which often is the case in large-scale emergencies. We also see many women reporting that their role in sort of providing the food for families sees increased tensions when, a climate-related disaster impacts crops and the availability of food. So therefore, they face increased tensions in the household and often do report violence. And then in places like Africa, where ActionAid works, women frequently report a close correlation between climate change and increases in things like child marriage, because, as families sort of struggle to cope and to feed all family members, they look at how they can sell off their daughters for dowry or make sure their daughters are being fed by, obviously transferring them to another family. So, I mean, there's a range of things we see across different contexts, but there's definitely, mounting evidence that there's a very close correlation between increased gender-based violence and climate change and indeed climate-related disasters.
And why do you think women and girls are particularly vulnerable in these disaster situations?
Well, I think we have to look at the broader situation facing women and girls around the world and the widespread discrimination, and particularly economic discrimination. And so ActionAid's work, we've seen a very close correlation between, economic injustice and gender-based violence. And so, and I guess perhaps the inverse, where women have access to resources or economic empowerment, that they're less vulnerable to violence against women. So some of those deeper discrimination issues play out. Gender roles is another one. I mean, as I mentioned, women play a vital role in providing, food for their families as part of their gender roles. So definitely in the situations where there's less food available in markets or crops are destroyed, that does increase the tensions. And also globally, we see a situation where men are more likely to be perpetrators of sexual violence and human trafficking and those kind of things, and women the victims. So really, I think this is deeply associated with entrenched patriarchy that's in every country in the world, and that devalues women's role in society. I think the only other thing I would say, and that we always need to remember, is who makes decisions around what gets resourced and prioritised in a climate related disaster. And this is where we know that women are, often excluded or less represented in decision making around climate change and related disasters.
That's such a good point about who gets to make the decisions. Women are so often left out of that process, aren't they? So, given all these challenges we've been discussing, what have you found actually works? What are the strategies or initiatives that successfully bring gender based violence prevention into disaster planning and response?
Absolutely, women's leadership is central, and making sure women are part of disaster planning, climate change planning, as well as decisions around resources. From ActionAid's work, however, we've seen that one of the areas that we've pioneered around the world in many different contexts affected by climate change and disasters has been what we call women led community based protection. And this is a model that focuses on how do we support women in disaster high risk communities to identify and define their own protection needs as part of preparedness work. So rather than just waiting for the disaster to strike and trying to respond to increasing gender based violence, we actually work with women beforehand to identify some of the risks they do face when climate related disasters happen, to look at possible actions they can take to prevent and respond to these risks, as well as think about their own resources and capacity to be able to respond, and how they can, work with other protection actors to help them achieve their protection actions. And we've rolled this out in different contexts, places like Kenya, Vanuatu, Bangladesh, even in places like Jordan. And what we found that this is increasing, women's safety and dignity in crisis. It's definitely leading to women being better organised when a crisis strikes. In a place like Vanuatu, we've seen women lobby for increased police posts in communities so they actually have protection from the legal system. We've seen them establish watch groups to be able to intervene in cases of violence that increase during disasters, as well as mobilise local leadership to really drive strong prevention messages.
Yeah, the importance of local knowledge and lived experience often comes up in this space. Is this one of the key factors in your work?
Absolutely. And I think one thing we've always felt is that, sometimes there's this treatment of local people, and particularly local women, as victims in need of support from outside. There's a lot of gender experts who are brought in from other countries. And actually, the most effective prevention strategies to respond to gender-based violence in disasters are about, supporting and equipping and resourcing local women to drive their own agenda. And I think that sort of has to be key to future agendas around this area.
And what are some of the critical considerations for future work in this space?
I guess the first thing I would say is that I think we do need to see a greater focus on, gender-based violence in preparedness. At the moment, our humanitarian system is very much geared to only responding when, gender-based violence presents in a crisis. So I think investing in that preparedness and actually seeing greater resources targeted to prevention, not just response, is critical. From our work as well that we've undertaken actually with Monash University around the gender responsive alternatives to climate change, I think there's a few key strategies which guide our programming and are also critical to making sure we've got targeted approaches on, a whole range of gender equality issues in relation to climate change and disasters. There's, four critical things that we believe are important. And one is investing in women's leadership and representation at all levels. So from the local to the national, regional and global, so that we can influence at all levels and make sure, the needs of women and girls are prioritised in responses. Resourcing women's organisations and networks is another critical action. These are the organisations that are best placed to respond to issues like gender based violence, so making sure they are resourced both in times of crisis but also over the longer term is critical. And the other thing we found from the research with Monash is that there's a whole body of knowledge that women have due to their gender roles, their Indigenous knowledge, that is completely overlooked when it comes to preparing for and responding to climate change and disasters. So how do we lift up and value women's knowledge alongside existing research, science, evidence? And of course, as I said before, I think we can't really tackle these very big problems unless we also have targeted funding around addressing some of the harmful social norms like child marriage, like gender-based violence. And too often we see in sort of funding that there's a desire to identify some of those risks, but there's no funding targeted to those very specific needs that will help over the longer term. So I think there's some of the things that are critical.
That sounds really comprehensive. What does it look like when this works well?
This actually comes from Vanuatu, so closer to our region, and ActionAid started working there a decade ago in partnership with the Department of Women's Affairs. And over the last 10 years, we've worked to establish a powerful grassroots movement of about 10,000 women across 7 islands on the country. And these are all community women from, rural communities, coastal communities, and they've been supported to build and understand their rights, to also look at how disasters affect those rights, and to work on developing disaster preparedness and protection plans, and that they use now to mobilise and respond when a crisis hits. And I mean, what's really powerful about this, it includes some of the most vulnerable women, like women with disabilities, who aren't just recipients when a crisis hits of humanitarian assistance, but they're actually at the forefront of leading responses with the abilities they have. They make sure support gets to the most vulnerable, and that there is an attention to, critical protection issues. And so what we see, because they have had access to resources when a crisis strikes, it has really enabled local women to lead and be at the forefront. And I think the other really exciting thing is that not only are we seeing more inclusive response targeted to some of those very specific needs like gender-based violence, but we're also seeing a shift in women's role in society as they sort of step up in a moment of crisis. Their communities are recognising their leadership, which is also changing the way women are seen in their households, in their communities. So for me, that's a success story. And I think, some of the solutions really lie in how can we get more investment locally? How can we support local women leaders and recognise they have enormous capacity to respond to some of these big challenges? But what they need is the resources and also in some instances some training just to be able to understand how the system works and how they can best engage in that.
Yeah, that's a great example. And I love the feedback loop where communities see women leading during disasters, which challenges traditional norms, and then they become the go-to responders next time. So it isn't just about disaster response, it's driving real social change too.
Exactly. And I think what we always find when women are leading, because of their traditional roles, I think they're often always thinking about others before themselves. So they think about the children, they think about the elderly, the more vulnerable people in community. They even think about their husbands. And so women's leadership does drive more inclusive response, and we've seen it time and time again from our work in disasters around the world. So, I think it is a critical strategy for how we can respond to that increasing risk of gender-based violence. Is how do we also invest in women's leadership to drive local responses? Because I do think it's a much more efficient and effective way to respond, and that, in a way that draws upon that local capability and those local networks.
So, we heard how climate disasters are exacerbating intimate partner violence globally, creating new risks on top of existing vulnerabilities. Frontline communities who contribute minimally to the climate crisis face disproportionate burdens of displacement and potential loss of land, identity, and culture. Throughout, our guests emphasise the need to centre lived experiences, local knowledge, and community-led solutions. Initiatives like women-led protection planning demonstrate the importance of investing in local leadership for transformative change. However, these compounding crises cannot be tackled in isolation. They are rooted in systemic inequalities, devaluing women, girls, and minorities. To build true resilience, we must dismantle harmful norms through sustained efforts at all levels, from households to global governance. This means holding corporations and decision-makers accountable while prioritising marginalised groups and scaling up climate action. A violence-free future demands bold commitments and collective action, centering the voices of those most impacted. I encourage you to reflect on these perspectives and consider your own role. whether reducing resource use, supporting local climate initiatives, or advocating for urgent climate action and gender justice. This is no easy task, but addressing these issues together is crucial for a sustainable world where all communities can thrive. This podcast is recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and acknowledge their continuing deep connection to country. We also recognise the many diverse traditional custodians across Australia and extend our respect to all Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and other Indigenous peoples around the world. This podcast was produced by Sian Human and Greta Robinstone for the ARC Centre of Excellence for the Elimination of Violence Against Women.